All right, guys. So the last lecture for this unit, for Unit 3, is going to be about tissue regeneration. Okay, so there are two basic ways tissue can fix itself. One of the ways is through repair. All right, this is a pretty dynamic process that involves regrowing blood vessels, involves a clotting process. There's also an inflammatory process involved with this. And then eventually, what will actually happen is the body will start to lay down what's called granulation tissue. This is kind of the basics or the embryonic tissue that will later turn into a scar. All right. The other process that can happen is what's referred to as regeneration. So this is complete restoration of damaged tissue back to its original form. In humans, this really only happens in our liver. Some of the cells of our eye can do that too. Our cornea is pretty good at regeneration, but for the most part, most of the rest of us can't do that. So if we were to cut a finger off or cut a whole arm off, we can't regrow that, but lots of other organisms can. So organisms called planaria, these are little flatworm-like organisms. Hydra, these are water kind of tube shaped. They a lot of times look like a sponge. And then obviously mammals, lots of lizards as well can do this. If they lose a tail, they can regrow it. But we as humans can't do that. We mostly do this repair section. All right. So tissue repair happens in a couple different steps. We get what's referred to as regeneration. So this is replacing of tissue by the same kind. Okay. We can get fibrosis. This is replacing of tissue with scar tissue. All right. Again, this is the more common type. And the determination on which method is used really happens because of two basic concepts. All right. So the first one is the type of tissue that's damaged. All right. Is it the type of tissue that can regenerate, or is it the type of tissue that we are simply going to replace with fibrous tissue? And then the severity of the injury. So the size and the extent at which the tissue is damaged will really make a difference. Okay, so here are the events that happen in the repair. So the first thing that happens is capillaries actually become very permeable, meaning that they will allow a lot of fluid and things to leak out into the area that is damaged. Once that happens, that area starts to become walled off, which is why when you damage tissue or damage any part of the body, we get this kind of localized swelling usually at first. Um, if you've ever been like stung by a bee or like bit by like a mosquito, we get that kind of raised red area around those the insect bite. That is an example of this type of an issue because we're trying to wall that off. We don't want that to spread. From there, the body then starts to lay down this kind of granulation tissue. So this is just kind of basic connective tissue for the most part that it allows for blood vessels, white blood cells, and other kind of proteins and things to start to stick to. This is similar to what they do when somebody has a burn and they go into the burn unit. They're trying to use a artificial type of granulation tissue to try to cover that burn and get healthy tissue to start to regrow off of. This process has changed quite a bit. We'll look at it a little bit more when we go through our skin unit, our integumentary unit during chapter 4. Right. And then from there, after we get this granulation tissue, we start the regeneration of surface epithelial. All right. So surface epithelial will regenerate really easily. We can replace it, change it back over, as long as we don't have a huge damage. So if you have a scratch in your skin, that can repair and replace itself. But if you cut down into, like you can see in this diagram here, if you cut down into the dermis, which is the second layer of tissue, then we get kind of this scar tissue formation, and you'll kind of probably have that scar for the rest of your life. So that's why if you've had surgery, you end up with this kind of scar where that cut was gone through, or if you've cut yourself deep enough to get down into this dermis. If it only involves the upper layers of skin, usually over time that will replace itself and you won't really notice it, or it will fade a little bit. But if we get all the way down into the dermis, that doesn't do that as easily. All right, so that's the first thing that happens. Capillary permeability, laydown of granulation tissue, and then regeneration of surface epithelium. Okay, from there, we'll talk a little bit about types of tissue that do this really well. So obviously, epithelial tissue from the last diagram does regenerate really easily. So skin, outer layers of organs, the linings of like our digestive system as well as our respiratory system. As long as there's not a huge extent of damage, those will replace themselves pretty well. Other types that do this are fibrous connective tissue. All right, so the dense connective tissue that makes up ligaments and tendons can actually replace itself pretty well as long as it has a good blood supply. The reason why people have to replace their ACL with either a cadaver or a donated piece of tendon from themselves is because your ACL doesn't have any blood supply. So that's one of the other things that's a huge issue for tissue regeneration is, do we have a blood supply here? And then obviously one of the other ones that replaces itself really well is bone tissue. And in most cases, bone tissue will actually be stronger where it was broken after it's repaired itself than where it was not broken. So usually you don't end up with a break in the same spot twice. All right. Tissue that regenerates is really poorly, skeletal muscle tissue. All right. Skeletal muscle tissue, when torn, usually tends to scar. So if you've ever had like a pulled hamstring, which we refer to as a strained hamstring, that strain causes little micro tears in the tissue and it doesn't want to heal very well, which is why most skeletal muscular injuries should have some physical therapy involved with them. That will actually allow them to regenerate and heal a little bit better or properly than if they were not treated. All right. Some tissue that will actually replace itself largely with just scar tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue is one of the biggest ones. People that sustain a cardiac arrest event or a cardiac infarction, they call it, all right, which essentially is a heart attack, the heart will actually lay down tissue in that area that was starved without blood and just turn it back into scar tissue. Now, if you think about it, this whole organ is supposed to pump, so it's supposed to contract and then relax. Those areas that have scar tissue laid down in them will not do that. So they lose huge cardiac functioning after a heart attack. Nervous tissue, specifically nervous tissue within the brain as well as in the spinal cord, also will not heal. It mostly will lay down scar tissue. We are starting to see some benefits now from specific therapies where we can regrow some of these connections. Not so much in the brain, but also in the spinal cord, we can see some of those. So I'll show you a slide here in a second that shows some of that damage. Okay. But this is definitely very indicative of like a heart attack. You can see this whole bottom of the heart is dead. That tissue is kind of more brownish and the rest of the heart is kind of a reddish color. All right, here's a couple other images. So this one you're seeing here is a joint. The red tissue is actually muscle tissue. All right, this spidery tissue you see up here at the top is that areolar tissue that we referred to the other day in connective tissue. Okay, and then this kind of Y structure looking here is actually a tendon. This looks to be the shoulder, most likely. So this is a bicep tendon coming up into the shoulder and then attaching. Okay, and then you can see this is a piece of cartilage right here, all right, and then a little bit more of some connective tissue off to the side. Any place that you see this yellowing, all right, that's scar tissue. All right, those tendons most likely either had a tear in them or they've got some friction sometimes from the upper portion of your scapula that kind of makes the point of your shoulder, right? So this is probably somebody who's used their shoulder quite a bit, mostly overuse, all right? And any of this yellow that you see in here is going to be scar tissue, okay? Same thing you can see down here. We have a normal brain on this side, scarred brain on the other side, right? Dementia is where you lose a lot of those connections within the brain and parts of the brain start to die off. Those parts that die off or are starved without blood will start to fill in with this kind of yellowish tissue, which is simply just scar tissue. Same thing would happen, and we're actually starting to see more of with people who have had concussions. All right, they get this kind of yellowing or scarring of the brain in certain areas where the concussion happened. Whereas before, we never really thought we would see this kind of damage. But when we start to do autopsies on people who have had multiple concussions, we start to see this kind of yellowing of the parts of the brain. All right. Last little bit here, and this is the last slide for this unit, is just developmental aspects of tissue. So when we start to form from that zygote, that initial cell, and start to grow into this kind of what we call a fibroblast or a blastula, all right, that blastula is multiple thousands and millions of little cells. Those cells start to dive in on each other and start to form a tube, all right, and then that forms layers. So there are three basic layers. There's an ectoderm, a mesoderm, and an endoderm. All right, so those layers will give rise to different levels of tissue. So the epithelial layers actually will come from all three of those. Okay, so epithelial tissue arises from all three of these layers. Muscle tissue and connective tissue specifically arise from this middle layer. All right, and then nervous tissue arises from that ectoderm, the very kind of middle layer around the outside. Okay, other things that we tend to see with old age, there's a decrease in mass of tissue as well as viability of tissue. So this really talks to viability, means blood flow and the ability for those cells to do what they were supposed to do. All right, so this is one of the reasons why, as we age, old people, their skin looks like it starts to thin, because it actually does. All right, they start to lose their ability to replace that tissue. All right, and that causes their skin to thin. They are also losing their ability to replace other tissues, muscle tissue, um, linings of the digestive tract and stomach and things of that nature. So sometimes when they say somebody died of old age, they're dying of this body's ability to replace those tissues in a timely manner. And then usually that sets off a cascade of things that cause some issues. Okay. All right. Big takeaways from this lecture. You need to know the steps of tissue repair. So the capillary permeability, the laying down of granulation tissue, and then the regeneration of surface epithelial or lay down of scar tissue. Those three basic things are going to probably be tested on, as well as some of the other parts, like what tissue replaces really easily, which types of tissues don't. All right, so just make sure you're taking a look at a couple things during this lecture, and always refer back to your reading guide as well. So a lot of that information's in there. So if it's covered in the reading guide, it's fair game for the assessment. All right, guys.